So thank you, Andrew and Bishal, for inviting me to be part of this day. I was reflecting on the fact that we've spent a lot of time talking about the process of the findings of new treatments and what new treatments have to go to. And to some degree also, we've spent a lot of time talking about some negative things around how small differences are amplified by pharma sometimes, and things are very expensive. I want people to still harbor a sense of strong hope. Having been in this world since 1982, when I started at the CCTG, it's unbelievably how differently cancer patients are treated now, how better they're supported. We haven't talked much about supportive care and palliative care, but it's really grown substantially, well integrated into cancer care. People are living longer and they are living better. But sometimes we're distracted by headlines that frankly offer a sense of false hope. And what I want to do in this talk is really go through some of the ways we as the public learn about cancer and cancer research, and where some of the things go wrong in our interpretation of what we're reading. So where does the public learn about what happens with cancer? It's really only a handful of sources, increasingly through social media, which is completely, of course, unregulated, even more so now that it's Muskified, through newspapers, radio, and television. But where do they get their content from? Well, usually it's via direct push of press or media releases from either pharma or universities or even funding agencies that support the research. Occasionally, it comes directly from scientists, and that's more likely to be in the social media place, or from investigative reporting. And all of us are familiar, I think, with some of the stories that come that way. So is there a problem with this? Is there a problem with having press releases and media releases being the source of most information? Well, sometimes there is, because those releases can sometimes paint an overly optimistic story. So it will be picked up and reported, because as we know, newspapers and television and radio need to have a story with a hook. They need to have a story that can be summarized in a headline, and they need to have perhaps nothing else big happening that day for the story to be picked up. And a lot of mainstream media just reprints or rereads the story verbatim without any kind of critical overview. But why this overly optimistic presentation of data? Well, I think from the pharmaceutical company point of view, it could impact sales, at least in places where direct-to-consumer advertising is possible. It could impact investment, their stock prices, and so on and so forth. For universities and granting agencies, it can be part of that public accountability. Look how well we are spending the money you've donated to us. Look at the research that's coming out and the promise that it holds. So that to me is a bit of a noble sense of feedback, but it would be good to also see universities and granting agencies have a balanced feedback to the public. You know, not everything we fund is turning to gold, which I think is quite honest. And why is this a problem for patients and the public? Because I think overstating the truth or just talking about the good stuff can lead to false hope and mistrust. And when I was still seeing patients as an oncologist, it wouldn't be unusual at all to have someone come to their clinic appointment with a handful of clippings that they found somewhere about a breakthrough that they were hoping they could get. So let's talk a little bit about how we can wisely interpret what we're seeing in the media. And those are all the buzzwords: breakthroughs, game changers, revolutionize, new standard of care. And those are the phrases that grab your attention, and those are the phrases that those writing press releases like to have around the top. Now, they could be true. the story of pembrolizumab and what it did to melanoma outcomes really was a game changer and a breakthrough, and it revolutionized treatment, absolutely no doubt. But many times those words are used to mean a much lesser type of gain, if any. And so there are a few scenarios where you see these kinds of stories coming out, sometimes on new tests that could help detect cancer early, sometimes on new studies of cancer treatment in the labs or clinical trials. And I'm going to give you some examples of each of those and then talk about how I would advise you to read those news reports with a tincture of wisdom. So let's look at some recent headlines about a cancer screening test coming from the Grail company, as in holy. This one, the headline was, "New blood test could revolutionize cancer treatment." And what was this headline based on? It was based on a trial called the Pathfinder trial, which was a study of the Galleri blood test from the Grail company. And this blood test measures circulating tumor bits of DNA. And its aim was to use the test in people without cancer to try to find it, and to find it early enough that they might be treated curatively. So they tested just over 6,400 patients got the test done once, and they were followed for a year, and they looked how often the test was positive or negative and what happened to those patients. They didn't compare them to people who didn't get the test. So it was really a study to say, does this ever detect cancer? And it did. 92 of those 6,400 patients tested positive. And of those 92, 35 were found to have a cancer after a bunch of screens. I imagine the remaining 57 or so felt kind of anxious that something was missed, but they don't talk about that. They don't really say how many of the 35 were actually an early stage cancer, because some of them turned out to be recurrences of old cancers the patients had had, apparently. But they do say that 48% of the non-recurrent cancers were low stage, stage 1 or 2. And of the 6,300 odd that tested negative on the test, 86 were false negatives, in that those patients were found through their routine screening tests to have a cancer during that 1 year period. So is this enough to know if this test is worth doing in routine practice to screen for cancer? I think you'd have to say no at this point, despite the fact they're selling it in the States for $1,000 per test. We don't know yet whether finding a few cancers will change death rates. And you really do need a large study comparing whether patients are dying more or less of cancer in a group that are tested versus those that are not. And fortunately, such a large study has completed recruitment in the UK. They've recruited 140,000 healthy volunteers. It's comparing an annual Galleri test versus no test. And both groups, importantly, get the usual follow-up care, including other cancer screening or pursuit of symptoms if they have them. And they're going to look at how often advanced cancers show up in both arms and what the mortality is. So what was wrong with that headline? New blood tests could revolutionize cancer treatment. Well, firstly, this was not a treatment trial. It was about screening for cancer in healthy people. And if you had cancer and were thinking about what new treatments could I guess, and you saw that headline, you'd probably be all over it thinking, well, maybe there's a new treatment for me if I only have a blood test. Secondly, at this point, revolutionize is a bit strong word. They do say could revolutionize, so I'll give them a little bit of a sympathy vote on that, because we don't know yet if applying this test broadly will in fact improve cancer mortality. A lot of the problems with some of the tests we use are they only detect large cancers. So finding a large cancer early doesn't really add anything if you can't necessarily cure it. So that's a headline to be suspicious of, and that's a good example of what we're seeing in some of these early cancer detection blood test headlines these days. What about studies of new cancer treatments coming out of the lab? Well, here's a headline, and this was great because it has both breakthrough and game changer in this title. New cancer breakthrough from Cambridge University, which already puts a little imprimatur of good quality, right? Could be a game changer. So I thought, whoa, what could this be? This was from October 16th this year. And then you read further down, and what they really have found is it was a research study on metastasis. And it says now this new study may have pointed researchers in the right direction to help them understand how cancer spreads, which could also lead to new treatment options in the future. And you read further down, and this is based on studies in mice. And so again, the attention-grabbing headline doesn't really marry well with all of the conditional statements and the fact that it's in mice in the beyond the headline. And finally, clinical trial headlines, which is where we spent all of today, or a lot of today. And there are two main types, I think, of misleading headlines. Those that pronounce a success based on a limited or very small study, when a larger trial is needed and may in fact be negative. And those pronouncing success by selecting those results to talk about, as opposed to ignoring results that might be more important. So here's one of the former, this one, New Hope for Cancer Patients, and this is from 2017. And this was an article written about a new drug that is intended to starve cancer cells of energy or their energy metabolism, coming from an Israeli company called Raphael Pharmaceuticals. And it says scientists believe their new drug, CPI 613, is a breakthrough for people suffering from the most devastating types of cancer. And in particular, they were talking about pancreatic cancer. And that 2017 article was based on this, which is a first in human, or phase 1 clinical trial rather, of safety and tolerability of that CPI 613 in combination with a triple drug chemo regimen in pancreatic cancer. And this was a trial of 20 patients. And of those 20, 18 were given the maximum dose of CPI 613. And of those, 11 achieved an objective response. So tumor shrank by a minimum of the amount required for an objective response. But don't forget, it was combined with a triple chemo regimen. But that was the headline that matched the phase 1. 2 years later, we again see coming a breakthrough pancreatic cancer treatment trial opens in Israel. So this is the phase 3 trial of that regimen. And it's already called a breakthrough. And sadly, just a month or so ago, this phase 3 trial of CPI 613 with modified FOLFIRINOX versus FOLFIRINOX alone did not show any significant improvements of response rate, progression-free, or overall survival. So if you had been a pancreatic cancer patient at some point along the story of this agent, you would have wanted this drug. And in fact, the company was making it available through some special access programs to people who were desperate for something. But in the end, it didn't really do what everybody was saying. It doesn't mean they were wrong to talk about the promise of something new when it was entering trials. What seemed wrong to me was how they'd already come to the conclusion that this was a game changer and a breakthrough and all of those other things, which isn't very nice for people suffering from cancer. And the second example I'm going to give is of the other type, which is where only certain results are talked about, and that's made to sound better. And this one is another pancreas trial. It seems to be ripe for important findings. Pancreatic cancer, as we all know, is a tough, tough one. And this was in 2019 when at the American Society for Clinical Oncology, a rather strangely designed trial was reported in pancreatic cancer patients. And this trial took patients who had pancreas cancer and a certain genetic change in their tumor, the BRCA gene that we talked about, was mutated. And we know those patients are more susceptible to certain types of treatment with drugs called PARP inhibitors. So this trial took patients with pancreas cancer and they randomly assigned them following getting chemotherapy and being stable to get a PARP inhibitor or nothing. And the oncologists who saw this trial were a little bit scratching their heads because they thought, in real life, we wouldn't do that. We would never stop chemo if somebody was doing well. But that's what they did in this trial. They gave half the patients or 2/3 of the patients a PARP inhibitor and the others nothing after, I think, 4 cycles of chemo. And they said this is a new standard of care in the articles coming out of it. It reduced the risk of progression or death. Now, to me, that is also a bit misleading because that's the definition of progression-free survival. It improved progression-free survival. And in fact, these data were strong enough that that same year, the FDA approved olaparib. So a real stamp of approval for metastatic pancreatic adenocarcinoma. But even in 2019, when the results were published in the New England Journal, the overall survival of patients showed no difference between the olaparib and placebo groups. And nobody was talking about that in the press. And the final results of mature survival data have since been published, and they continue to show no difference between the arms. Now, the shapes of the survival curve are a bit different, which you'd expect if you stop treatment in one arm and not in the other. But the point is, this sounded like it was going to make a big difference to patients' lives, the way it was presented, but it wasn't really true. I wish I'd stuck in lots of examples of breakthroughs that really were, but the point of this session is to really make you wise in looking at those headlines. So what is a reader to do? I mean, like, do you just stop reading about it? Not a bad idea, because you can get Google overdose, and it's really stressful. Maybe not so much for patients, but for family members to be seeking the breakthrough in the news, and you find it, then you can't find out anymore. How do you get it? But I wanted to start by saying that not every article saying that something is important is false. Not all of them suffers from hyperbole. Some of them, some cancer results really are amazing. And that's kind of why we have people who spend their careers learning about cancer and treating cancer patients and keeping up with the literature so they know what those are and can guide you. But if you are reading a report, first of all, look at where it's coming from. Which is the media source? So USA Today versus the New York Times or Globe and Mail. Does it have a writer associated with it, or is it just a wire service dump? If there's a writer associated with it, are there independent interviews of experts not associated with the report commenting on it? Because usually they have a sober second commentary to add. In terms of the report itself, be a critical reader and ask yourself, is the research in test tubes mice or people? It's true that eventually the things that make a difference in human cancer do come from laboratory research and research in mice. But if it's there now, it won't turn into something or even testing in patients probably for quite some time. And some of those don't succeed. If the report is a clinical trial, is it a small trial? Like, you have to be suspicious of a trial of 18 patients declaring a breakthrough. Sometimes it happens. I remember when Gleevec was first described in chronic myeloid leukemia, and all the patients essentially had a complete response. That was a small trial, and it really was a breakthrough. But a new drug given with 3 other chemo drugs that we know are active, not so sure that you can interpret that in that way. Are there exciting results based on outcomes important to patients? And it was very misleading to see the POLO trial talk about progression or death. Because to me, that sounds like, as a layperson, I'd read that like, are people surviving, yes or no? But that's not what it was. It was progression-free survival. So those are sort of, I don't know, simple advice as you're reading the literature. And clearly, if you think something's really important to find out about, I, as an oncologist, used to spend a lot of time talking to patients about what they'd found in the newspaper or on Google or other things to put it into context. But I used to get sometimes upset, not at the patients, but at the media that was really creating these narratives of hope every 5 minutes, when it needed to be balanced by some thoughtful commentary in those same media. So I'd like to thank you for your attention. Glad that you made it to the end of the day. One of the few sunny days now between now and May, probably. And I welcome any questions.